Thank you very much for the warm introduction. It's my great pleasure to be here, ladies and gentlemen, at the request of the ECSSR, the Emirate Centre for Strategic Studies and Research. I've just heard about some of the eminent publications from this organisation, so it's a great privilege to be here to share tonight some views on what the G20 presidency is focusing on this year in 2014, but equally important to listen to the constructive criticism and questions I might receive from all of you. Of course, it's a great pleasure to be here in the United Arab Emirates too, both as an Australian and on behalf of the G20. From Australia's perspective, we have a very warm relationship. There are clear complementarities in our economies, and we've seen growth in our people-to-people links. So I'm pleased to be here and looking at all of you and discussing today the cooperation and work we hope to take forward both bilaterally, but also more importantly on the G20 in this fora. If I could just start to make a few remarks, please, about what the G20 itself is, and then I'll turn to the topic of this evening's discussion, growth and prosperity. The strength of the G20 is really in its diversity. It's an unusual organisation in that it brings together both emerging, developed, industrialised countries. It brings together those from traditional blocs such as the G7, the BRICS and other members together in one group, representing approximately 85% of the world's economy, approximately 75% of trade and 2/3 of foreign direct investment, 65% of the world's population. It naturally, when consensus is achieved, can influence outcomes. But its core objectives of lifting global growth and creating jobs, resilience following the global financial crisis, are good for all nations, not just for the G20. We know, for example, that economic growth is the most powerful weapon against poverty. And engagement with non-G20 members is a key priority. We don't have a license on good ideas. We face common challenges, and it's important that we listen to the views of others so that our agenda reflects those views to some extent, the degree that we can, and the results of the G20's work benefit all of us. And we recognise that G20 is not a representative organisation. It's a collection of large economies that share common interests. So there's an onus on us to listen to the views of others and work together. Excuse me. Wonderful. So the priorities our leaders have set for us are those that are on the screen now. Promoting stronger economic growth and employment outcomes by empowering the private sector. Making the global economy more resilient to future shocks by continuing our work that has been ongoing since 1999, but particularly since the global financial crisis in 2008-09. And strengthening global institutions to ensure their ongoing relevance to the contemporary world. Achieving all of this will not be easy, but we feel, and our leaders have told us, that one of the keys will be for governments to enable the private sector to drive economic activity, as in the end only it can deliver the sustainable growth in investment, trade and job creation that the world needs. If we consider why this is the focus of the G20 this year, it's important to think about what we've seen in the last few years since the global financial crisis. I won't go into the detail on the graph, but the key point is the dropping down on the right-hand side of the forecasts. Although we've seen some positive forecasts earlier this year from the IMF, global economic growth has repeatedly been revised downwardly. We haven't seen the growth and return to growth we experienced before the global financial crisis, nor have we seen return to employment levels that we experienced before then. Therefore, our leaders have expressed the view that we need to focus on that which we can take us forward, growth and enabling the private sector. It also reflects an understanding that the response to the global financial crisis, austerity measures, fiscal consolidation or quantitative easing, all perhaps appropriate to the circumstances in which are applied, but all which have limits. There are limits to the government response. So this year, the G20 has focused on taking actions forward that they themselves, individual members, can take, in addition to macroeconomic coordination. So what we see here on the side, a range of activities we plan to take to stimulate growth. I'm sorry, it seems the text has slipped, perhaps with the ratio being adjusted on the screen. But the key thing is that in February this year, our finance ministers agreed that collectively we would work towards lifting collective GDP by 2% over the next 5 years. We plan to do that through taking actions to address private infrastructure investment, removing obstacles to trade, creating jobs and lifting participation, and empowering development. And I'll touch on each of those. First, on infrastructure. The most striking point here is what we have there at the bottom of the slide. The OECD estimates that over 70 trillion investment in infrastructure is needed worldwide by 2030. Frankly, 70 trillion is probably unimaginable for many of us, but what it does reveal is there's a common interest in most economies to use infrastructure to drive growth. Investment in infrastructure plays a critical role in lifting growth and employment. In the short term, particularly on the employment side, in the longer term through structural change and productivity gains. Individually, G20 countries are committed to remove impediments to private sector investment. Policies in the comprehensive growth strategies that countries might take forward include reducing regulatory burdens, safer and more predictable policy frameworks, and removing red tape. Collectively, though, we also want to work together to work with multilateral development banks, see if we can use their resources more wisely, more effectively, and look at how we may be able to engender greater cooperation between the private sector and regional multilateral development banks. We've commissioned a number of studies in recent years as to what might be the impediments, if you like, between what are essentially liquid capital markets and the demand for infrastructure in a range of economies. In the past, in Africa, these studies have suggested that more PPP centres, public-private partnerships, are required. This year, a separate study in Asia identified that, in fact, project preparation was the key. We certainly had PPPs in place, but many countries were unable to actually develop what were described as by the private sector as bankable projects, projects that were attractive to investment. So we're now looking at what steps we may need to take in that regard. We're also looking to remove obstacles to trade and have introduction of competition reform in our economies. Trade is a clear driver of growth, and this chart really shows the relationship in broad terms between goods and services trade in red and GDP growth in blue. And you can see there's a direct parallel. We feel that through taking structural reform, through steps domestically to facilitate businesses engaging with regional and global value chains, we can deliver productivity gains in this front. The OECD, for example, estimates that reducing global trade costs by 1% would increase income by 40 billion, 65% of that accruing in developing countries. So there is scope for action. The sort of steps we're looking at, and this again is G20 countries themselves taking actions, is cutting costs imposed by regulation, streamlining customs procedures, making logistics and transport services more efficient, and perhaps improving rail links. I must stress that each country is choosing their own options, the own actions they wish to take. What we share is a common ambition to lift GDP by 2% over the 5-year period and the focus areas. What we need to do through this year, and we're doing this now, is sharing with each other our proposed actions and then subjecting to proper scrutiny. Scrutiny by international organisations to assess whether we are delivering on our promises. The next area I'd like to touch on is creating jobs and lifting participation. For all of us, this is a key issue. Without jobs, growth isn't sustainable, both politically, socially, and economically. So this year, we're having an exchange among the membership on the lessons learned, the successes and the failures in the past, with a particular focus on youth unemployment and female participation in the workforce. These have been identified by the Group of 20 as 2 areas where we think we can make real gains, both for those directly concerned in terms of employment and also in terms of productivity for our economies. I'd like to now just touch on empowering development. Since 2010, development has been a part of our agenda. We have a dedicated development working group. This year we've worked hard to ensure there's greater coherence across the entire agenda and all our working streams consider the impact of their actions on developing countries. As I noted at the beginning, over 60% of the world's poor within the G20, so we don't look at this in terms of nationality, we look at it in terms of impact, giving consideration to low-income countries as well as those within the G20. The reasons for this are evident there on the screen. 1.3 billion people still live on less than $1.25 a day. And emerging markets and developing economies contribute to more than 2/3 of global growth. So if we can achieve change in those countries, it benefits all of us. Development benefits all. It contributes to economic growth. So this year we're hoping to, as it outlines there below, build better investment environments, improve tax administration in developing countries, increase access to financial services and reduce the cost of remittances, undertake more work on food security, and further take forward skills training and human resource development. This chart here shows that relationship I was mentioning before. What we have there is really the major areas of the finance agenda, the traditional agenda within the G20. What we're trying to do is link it into the work we're doing in the development working group. So when actions are taken by the G20 on the finance track, they give consideration to the broader impact for others. I'd like now just to turn to the other half of the G20s, if you like, the work that we undertake. And this is probably more familiar to many of you because it's dealing with the resilience of the global economy, what is seen by many as the traditional work of the G20 since 1999. This year, we'd like to focus on a range of areas: reforming global institutions in the global financial system, which is, as mentioned, continuing work from before, strengthening tax systems, working on energy market resilience, and fighting corruption. Reforming global financial institutions and the global financial system have been an ongoing key issue for the G20. This ranges from dealing with issues that emerged during the 2009 crisis and the aftermath, such as the issue of too big to fail. Banks and financial institutions are systemically so important that if they should fail, it has an impact across the whole of our economies, and sometimes multiple economies for the flow on. In response to the crisis, we saw governments provide backup for these through use of public funds. This may be appropriate in an emergency, but the G20 doesn't believe that's appropriate on an ongoing basis. It risks moral hazard. Those institutions usually now make decisions on the basis that they have a backup. We'd like to move away from that so that we have financial institutions through cross-insurance and greater capital able to defend and protect themselves. Obviously, strong and secure financial markets benefit all of us, not just the G20. And the work we undertake in this regard is implemented through the appropriate international bodies. The G20 itself doesn't have a secretariat. The work it does, the consensus it achieves, is taken to the relevant bodies, which include many members outside the G20, of course, for discussion and then implementation. So bodies such as the Finance Stability Board, IMF, World Bank, and so on. Basel III, for example, on banking regulation is a key area of work for the G20, and this year we want all our members to meet their commitments in that regard. Other areas we're doing work on and continuing is addressing shadow banking risks and making derivative markets more transparent and easy to understand, as this is a key area in the issues faced by many governments in 2009. We also want to strengthen the trading system. We want to have a discussion that recognises the importance of the WTO and the centrality of a multilateral trading system. But we want to have a discussion about the role of FTAs and RTAs, regional trade agreements. All of us are undertaking those negotiations in many different forms, and they are by themselves a preferential trade agreement. So we want to see how they can benefit business, but also how over time they may become a pathway or return to a more unified multilateral system. And that's a long-term project. It's not something we'll achieve in 1 year. But my minister, for example, one of my ministers, a trade investment minister, believes firmly that if we achieve liberalisation through such agreements over time, the cost, if you like, of returning to a multilateral system negotiation is less. Many governments will have given up those. Ideally, of course, we should progress the negotiations in Geneva, but for a range of reasons, we haven't always been able to achieve that. Energy market resilience is essential. Oh, I beg your pardon, I've jumped a slide. I'll just see if I can go back to fighting corruption. There we are, energy market resilience. As it suggests up on the screen, access to competitively priced energy is critical for businesses to expand, they're critical for households, and it's critical for governments. It's an issue that's relevant to many of our economies. In the G20 until now, we've had an energy sustainability working group that's looked at energy efficiency as its main area of focus. We wish to continue that and work we've done on the transparency of energy markets. We've had exchanges established, for example, on information around the petroleum market that is now working effectively. This year, we're looking for an opening, a broader discussion, if you like, on global energy architecture. This reflects the recognition among our governments that there is no one energy institution internationally at present that represents all the major suppliers and consumers of energy. We have many different institutions, and they all do good, effective work, but we don't have one that brings together that group as a whole. We're not advocating necessarily for that. We want to have a discussion about what may need to make those government institutions more resilient and to make them more transparent. So we'll probably have at the end of this year an agreement on principles to start that discussion. Corruption. Clearly important for inclusive growth and development is that we remove corruption wherever possible, and this is a risk that we all face. This year, we're undertaking a range of activities. We hope to agree at the end of the year on high-level principles on beneficial ownership and transparency. This relates to shell companies, an agreement that is that these shell companies and the details associated with them are made public. We're not opposing the use of those companies, but we feel markets need to be informed about them, as do governments. We're also looking at greater sanctions in regard to corruption and the threat of bribery from overseas in our domestic legislative systems, and giving greater strength to our judiciaries. It's blurred on the screen, but the OECD estimates that over US $1 trillion is paid in bribes each year, and the cost of corruption is close to $2.6 trillion a year. So that's approximately 5% of the global GDP. Of course, the actions of the G20 alone aren't going to address that immediately, but we think taking forward those standards and the transparency principles that I've been discussing, we can achieve some of that. I'd just like to touch a little bit on the need to work with partners and our need for us to listen outside. Over the years, the engagement with the G20 has grown. As you'd expect, there's a demand for a G20 action on many issues. I'm sorry, it's stuck on there. Within our formal structures now, we have engagement with business, civil society, labour, think tanks and youth. These groups have evolved over time and now have a formal structure of presentation to the G20 as a group. That is, each of them, usually appointed the steering committees by the host government, coordinate among themselves, and not only within G20 countries, on what they think the G20 as a whole should be addressing. And then they hold a summit and provide those recommendations to the host to share with other members. This year, looking for clearer, concrete, practical outcomes, we've had discussions with most of those groups from early on and encouraged them to come with us as 3 or 4 key recommendations and to hold their summits early. In the past, most of those recommendations have been presented to leaders at the summit. And while that's very good for engagement with leaders, it doesn't leave governments much time to respond substantively. This year, we've received recommendations now from the Business 20, the C20, the civil society groups, from the T20, representing academic groups, and Y20 youth groups. We've received them already and now circulated them to our members and are considering how we can take action on them. To give you an example, the B20, the business community, has called for early implementation of the Bali package, maintenance of the G20 pledge against protectionism, greater work on global value chains and supply chains, and a discussion around FTAs and how they may lead to greater liberalisation. So you can see already that some of the themes we're taking forward reflect those discussions that we've had this year. There's an onus on us to make sure that the priorities we're addressing do match, broadly speaking, with those that are coming to us. Of course, it's not just linked to those groups. I'm sorry, I can't go to the next slide, but Australia also has a series of, through its host of the G20 Summit as president this year, we also have the opportunity to invite a number of guests. This was established in 2010, and I've listed now on the screen the guests for this year. Each year, and this is not Australia's decision, but that of the G20 as a whole, the chair of the African Union, the national rotating chair, attends, and this year is Mauritania. The rotating national head of the new Economic Partnership for African Development, this year Senegal. The rotating head of ASEAN, Burma or Myanmar. Each year, those representatives are invited to the meeting. Spain is also a permanent guest, and as host, my Prime Minister has also invited 2 regional neighbours, Singapore and New Zealand. So these countries, while not representative of the world, bring to the table different views, and in our year they've participated in the meetings throughout, from the working groups at the lowest level and to the summit at the end of this year. Finally, outreach is important. Events such as this, where I go out and speak and our diplomatic missions reach out to others and we engage with international organisations, regional organisations, think tanks, and listen to their views, is equally important as those exchanged with governments. Because in the end, to be effective, the outcomes we've set for ourselves will only be achieved with the help of the community as large, not just by governments. And we need to be held to scrutiny and to judgment. As part of that, at the end of this year, we hope to improve our communication with a 3-page communiqué by leaders, and we'll publish the growth strategies I mentioned at the beginning of the year, and also the assessments by international organisations of their effectiveness. And we hope that this will continue over the next years. So we'll be, in future, if you like, held accountable for the commitments we're giving this year. I'll stop there with the last slide just on further information. Of course, we can distribute through our diplomatic mission here further information to those who are interested, but I'm also very happy to take questions and participate in the discussion this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Daniel Sloper, for a very interesting lecture. Your thoughts and ideas were very stimulating and of significance to all of us. شكرا للأستاذ دانيال سلوبر على هذا.
Thank you very much, Dr. Daniel Sloper, for this brief but rich presentation. And thank you for shedding some light on the meeting you will hold in Australia in the near future. And thank you for sharing with us the topics that we can discuss here. And thank you for sharing with us your point of view regarding the challenges that the world economy is facing, and the stability and instability that some countries are witnessing in terms of economy. Now we open the door to the questions. I would like to remind you to introduce yourself and be brief, please. Yes, doctor, you have the floor.
Dominating lecture. You mentioned about eliminating corruption, and the G20 loses about $40 trillion as a whole from the developing countries, particularly in corruption. How do you intend, how the countries intend to remove such an obstacle from the country's economies? The other question, small one, is do you intend to make bridges with the GCC, and how do you intend to do that with the Gulf Cooperation Council? Thank you very much.
We will take like 3-4 questions and then we can answer. سؤال ثاني تفضلوا. Okay, you may answer the question, please.
Thank you very much for the question. If I might respond in reverse order. Firstly, in terms of cooperation and engagement with the Gulf Cooperation Council, I had the opportunity earlier in this week to meet with the Secretary General and to go through in a little bit more detail some of the points I raised this evening. And my key objective there was to outline what the G20 is doing, but also to listen to what the GCC is doing in this region in terms of economic integration and its plans there. Because what we're looking for is, if you like, coherence. The G20 is not a representative body, but it obviously has impact on some of the decisions we're all making. So we want to have that discussion and learn from each other and make sure that we're not duplicating the work of other regions, but complementing and reinforcing it. And I was pleased to hear that, in fact, not surprisingly, I think most governments are interested in economic growth and jobs, but we learnt a little bit through the exchange about how that might be addressed and the steps that are underway here. In terms of anti-corruption, the discussion point I made here was a global figure, not just a G20 figure in terms of the estimate of lost revenue due to corruption. What we can do in the G20, and we don't want to impose an international standard in this regard, is ask that our members adhere to their laws, ask that they strengthen their judiciaries, and ask that they increase the sanction for threats of foreign bribery or corruption, and that they apply those laws. And I think that, as we all know, is a key element for all of us. And no one country is immune. My own country and others are all subject to these threats, and we need to prosecute them through the law. And we're seeing that happening. We're also looking at greater work on transparency, and that extends across our agenda, if you like, because the G20 strength, in a sense, is on governance and transparency. So be it the work we're doing on tax, be it the work we're doing on anti-corruption, or on principles of beneficial ownership, the underlying intent in relation to them is to make information more transparent. Not always public, sometimes more transparent to tax authorities, more transparent to governments, sometimes publicly. We feel that information allows more informed decision making.
Thank you. Another question? Yes, please. العمار اللي عدالك.
Thanks. I'd like to ask in relation to the
Your
sanctions.
name, please.
Sorry, okay. Joseph Kazawani, I'm a senior legal counsel with the Tisalat Group. So the context of trade development and providing incentives, we've got currently a regime of increased sanctions between the European Union and the Americans on one side and the Russians on the other. How impacting would that be towards that goal of 2% growth over the 5 years? And I've got another question, which is, you've mentioned multilateral development, regional-based blocks, but in the BIT section, which is the bilateral investment treaties, Indonesia and Brazil have indicated that they're intending to move away from that regime. How impacting would also that be towards promoting growth and trade. Thanks.
Thank you. Do you want to answer that, please?
Thank you. Some good questions. Certainly, the situation we're seeing at the moment, I think, globally is having an impact on forecasts for growth. I know for Russia and for a number of others through IMF data that they're already downgrading their expected growth patterns. So that'll have a huge impact, and we have to acknowledge that on our forecast. That's not to say we shouldn't pursue it. It just, if anything, underlines the necessity for governments to pursue more reforms to support business growth. The G20 itself, though, is predominantly an economic forum. It hasn't entered into strategic or security issue discussions in the past. We did have a discussion last year on Syria at the summit when the leaders collected, unscheduled. So we may have an opportunity for further discussions. But in the short term, I can't see the forum as a whole, which is always focused predominantly on economic common interests, shifting to a security strategic focus. But we have to acknowledge, as you've pointed out, that these sort of events have a dramatic impact on forecast growth. On bilateral investment treaties, to be frank, we have not discussed that within the fora. There is a general tendency, I think, on trade economic issues to favour the multilateral approach, but we also acknowledge that for a range of reasons in the trade context, for example, that hasn't progressed as far as we would like. And that's part of the reason why many of us are involved in regional trade agreements and bilateral trade agreements, which are by their nature essentially preferential, but are also addressing contemporary issues that our businesses face that aren't being picked up at the moment in the multilateral agenda. From an Australian perspective, we would like those to merge, both the agendas and the nature of RTAs and FTAs. The latter is a long-term project. I think we need to be realistic about that. The former, I think I'm always optimistic. We've had some setbacks on the agenda agreed in Bali, but over the next few months we would hope that we can bring that back on board and see agreement there so that we can see trade facilitation and other elements of that package rolled out to the benefit of all the world, and particularly the developing world.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Welcome to Abu Dhabi. I'm Sheikh al-Maskari from Abu Dhabi. There were two very important words in the economic development that you mentioned. One was inclusive development, and the other one was transparency and corruption, which our colleague have touched on. In the inclusive development G20 2012, the agreement was formally signed and published for economic empowerment of women. My question, after signing that agreement, I have read it again and again, is really very impressive. Do you have actual criteria for measuring and tracking the countries in the G20 and G7 who are actually implementing those fine articles of 2012 economic empowerment and inclusiveness? That's my first question. Then I'll come to the second. The second one, we are talking about corruption and transparency. They're again very fancy words. But when you see that, I feel that I'm in the wrong business. $1.2 trillion is expected. So there are a lot of good soul in this world. Must be, as we say in the street language, it takes two to tango. Okay, if corruption is not one-sided, it's like any business, it's two-sided. Now, what are the measures taken by G20 for their member nations to ensure that there is at least reduction of corruption? When not only now we found out, thank God for the electronic media, we found out that even the banks are being fined billions of dollars for engaging in money laundering and actually deceiving the clients. Now, also the definition of corruption, I have always considered, how would you call corruption when in some societies the culture requires some sort of spending for the services? In the West, you call it consultancy services. In the Arab world, we call it wasta. Would you define that as corruption? Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's a question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think the questions have ranged from the specific to the philosophical, but I wouldn't disagree probably on most of your points. If I could start at the beginning on economic empowerment of women, you're absolutely right. In 2012 there was a commitment there, and I think, to be frank, we need to do more on our accountability, because the data we use, we don't have a secretariat, so the data we use is public data, either published by individual countries or through the ILO to assess our achievements. So what we've tried to do this year is to focus more, particularly in our employment task force, on the issue of female participation in the workforce, which is a part of economic empowerment, and youth unemployment. And we're in discussions now about whether we may be able to agree to some sort of collective target on that. And why that's important is because of the point you're making, I think. We need to be held accountable. And we need to be able to say publicly through our governments what we've committed to, and then in subsequent years track that. And that is what we're trying to instigate this year, a greater strength of that, because we'll have the ILO and we'll have other international organisations for the first time giving us a report card, if you like, on what we're promising and what we're going to deliver. So we may not see a great change this year, but if in next year or the year after, and that'll be the real test of not only my presidency but the G20, we'll be able to say, did we meet our 2% target? If not, why not? Did we meet our agreement on increasing female participation in the workforce? And if not, why not? Sometimes it may be a lack of will, other times it may be external circumstances, such as the previous questioner alluded to in terms of the international environment. But I don't think you'd find many of our governments disagreeing with the need to be held more accountable on this issue. On the two to tango, my view is it doesn't matter who's tangoing, they both, if it's two or more, deserve sanction. And what we're looking for domestically in each of our countries is a strengthening of that sanction, if you like, the legislative frameworks around corruption. How we define corruption, I don't think we've had that discussion within the G20 in specific. It's probably more with reference to the international instruments, and rather than a particular debate whether you describe it as consultancy fees or others. I think, generally speaking, it's that within the law and without the law. And what we're talking, and the figures I give, are those activities that are clearly outside the law. Please. I think you want to follow up.
Oh, we have a hot discussion now.
To go positively, does G20 in their implementation process of the 2012 agreement or protocol for economic empowerment of women for inclusive development, as I asked, do you have a measurable criteria in which you can measure and evaluate and rank out of the G20 nations which one is actually doing that? And if so, do you have an award or reprimand situation in which you can tell a G20 nation member that, you know what, you better get going, you are behind this? Okay.
The short answer is the only data we have is that which is available to you. That is sovereign data published by individual governments or government data published by the ILO. In terms of sanctions, no, we don't have any. Our organisation operates on consensus. So our outcomes are achieved by consensus, and then we have to, only through peer pressure or public scrutiny, are we able to apply that pressure. We don't have a sanction, we're not committed through constitutions or formal agreements. It's through the commitment of the leaders. And they need to be held accountable both by each other and by the people in the countries they represent.
تفضل.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Firstly, I missed some of your lecture, unfortunately. Introduce myself, I'm Dr. Anas. I'm Associate Professor of Law and a managing partner of a legal consultancy firms here in Abu Dhabi. My question is very simple. Among the sequences of financial crisis, which is we're still living today, what the focused agenda would be of G20s in Australia? And the other questions, talking about financial crisis again, and considering Australia has been definitely proved that's the best model of governance over the world. To what extent do you think would contribute the G20 to apply or to, let's say, the concept of governance and to the whole group of 20s and to the whole world as well? To what extent would contribute the G20s? And the other question, from your point of view, what would be the perspective of Australia to make the G20s of next summit a successful one? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do you want to take that? Okay, please.
Thank you. I did touch a little bit on financial regulation, but I'll just cover that quickly. There's continuing work in response to the global financial crisis, and it is implemented through other bodies, but it is driven by the consensus achieved through the G20. And the focus is on what the too big to fail issue about structurally or systemically important financial institutions and how we deal with them going forward as governments, making derivatives markets more transparent, implementing Basel III, banking reforms, and broader transparency measures around beneficial ownership. They're all elements of ongoing work. We're also starting new work on the tax agenda in regard to base erosion profit shifting, which is to do with transfer pricing where companies through legitimate means don't always pay tax in the jurisdiction in which they earn the revenue but shift it to another jurisdiction. We're not arguing against different governments having varying tax rates. That's up to each individual government. But we'd like to see an automatic exchange of information between tax bodies so that governments are aware of those transfers and they can make decisions about the policies they wish to implement. We've also started some new work and discussion on energy, which we see, and the anti-corruption issue, as also forming part of the response and also making the global economy more resilient going into the future. And these are all elements that go beyond the G20. They involve commitments by the G20, but are implemented in the relevant international bodies and therefore obviously have an impact on all in trying to make a more stable, secure economic system. On governance, I think in Australia's case, certainly we've had some successes, but we still learn many things from others, and I wouldn't necessarily say we should be the model to follow. We responded well to the financial crisis because of our prudential authority and our Securities Commission in Australia having what would be described as, I guess, robust regulation. So we did better than others, perhaps, in some regards, but we still have our challenges ahead of us. On broader international governance issues, the G20 has been an advocate for reform of the IMF for some years. We supported the 2010 reforms. We don't believe the organisation reflects the contemporary reality, and we think that we need to take that forward further. We have one member who is yet to pass the reforms associated with that. And in that regard, they've tried 2 or 3 times, and if we're not successful at the end of this year, I think there'll be a more robust discussion again about what might be needed to rebalance the IMF. Our discussions on energy are going to this area as well, where we're now thinking about how energy institutions should reflect the current market. Not necessarily advocating for a change in the sense of creating a new institution, but looking at things such as the IEA Associate Initiative. Does this serve the purpose of having more partners involved in discussions on energy, or should we be looking at other forums, the IEF or ARENA and others, and seeing how they can link together so that they incorporate all those views? Success, sorry, your last question. The simplest thing for me is, in terms of success, is to have our government leaders stand at the end of the year and be able to point to concrete, practical actions they have taken. So they should be able to say in a very clear message, we've agreed collectively on financial regulation and economic coordination. Domestically, in each of our governments, we're taking a series of steps to strengthen our economies and support growth, and that can be understood by the everyday person. They can see the impact that's having on them. And that impact may not be delivered in the first year. It may take some years to come out, but that you, me, or anybody else on the street has an understanding of what the G20 is doing in this regard, because it's a very diverse, complicated agenda, but to be effective, it has to deliver on that ambition of lifting growth and jobs. Thank you.
تفضل. العماري.
I want to speak Arabic, please. Arabic, please.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. My question is, the economy, the world economy is interrelated with each other. How can we achieve global growth in economy while there is competition in armament and there is poverty and there are wars and there is instability, while we are witnessing that billions of dollars are spent to finance wars? How can we achieve a global development?
I think I'd start from the point where the G20's value add is, if you like, because the issues you raise are serious issues, but for the G20, it needs to look at where is its special value, if you like, to address some of those challenges, because there are many international institutions trying to tackle them, some with more success than others, and we don't want to intervene in processes where we're not appropriate. So we operate at the moment on an economic basis, and I think a key to development, economic development and sustainable inclusive growth, is making sure governments and the private sector work together. Both have a role to play in the sense of ODA, helping development, but also in terms of looking at how the private sector can invest into the growth, be it in individual countries or providing employment opportunities. And that's not going to guarantee a solution to all the issues you're raising, but that's one reason in the work that the G20 is now doing, that it doesn't matter in what track we're looking at issues, we ask that people give consideration to the world's poor, that we think about the impact on those countries. So before, for example, I spoke about the tax agenda in the finance track. In the development side, we recognize that many countries can't actually meet that new standard that's emerging at this stage. We need to develop a pathway towards that. The challenge for most of them is actually revenue collection. The lowest income countries are losing more through missed revenue, tax revenue, than they're receiving through ODA. So they've got other more fundamental challenges ahead of them. And we need to recognize that and work out pathways towards that. In terms of armaments and broader conflicts, I think the United Nations and other bodies are probably better suited to address that. Certainly some of the members overlap, but at this stage I wouldn't see the G20 as a forum in which we would be able to effectively address some of those challenges, and it may be best left to the appropriate institutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
I'm taking this opportunity to thank Mr. Sloper for this lecture about the G20. I wish, of course, I wish Australia all the best and successful preparation for the coming meeting. Actually, there are three issues bothering me with regard to the world economy that probably G20 will tackle in the coming meeting. First, the status of the current world economy is really bothering, especially when you think about Europe, for instance, where unemployment is more than 11%. There is no growth, and they are really now, they don't know how to manage this situation. Of course, this weak economic situation affecting many countries in the world, including Australia, our region as well, because emerging economies are affected as well. Now we're seeing slow growth in countries, important country like China, which affects demand for commodities, whether your commodities or our commodities. We are all in the same boat, actually. So hopefully the G20, this issue of slow economic growth should take an adequate attention. The second worrying aspect is the financial market. I'm not sure we have learned enough the lesson from the financial crisis, because what happened is based on the cheap money provided through the quantitative easing that initiated by the central bank, people have been encouraged to take risk. And they have bought a lot of risky assets. Now, if you see the valuation of securities all over the world. It's exaggerating. It's like a gamble. And I'm really worried once the Federal Reserve in America withdraw this quantitative easing, which will be soon in October, and they will start probably increasing interest rate. I don't know what will happen to these risky assets. We still remember what happened last year when they just talk about tapering. And everybody got afraid, and there was a huge sell-off of assets. Many countries in the emerging market have been affected, actually. I don't know what will happen in October or in the coming month, but this is also a worrying aspect. Third and last worrying issue is the situation between the West and Russia. And this is, we should not underestimate what could happen, economically speaking, based on this political situation. Many companies have been affected by the sanctions. Russia is reacting to that. They are taking counter sanctions as well. So these are the three major issues I think that should be taken into consideration in the coming meeting of the G20, and I trust Australia will convey this message. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you very much for your observations and questions. I think in regard to the first issue, the points you made about unemployment, the integration of the world economy, and the impacts of different economies in terms of growth have on each other are the very reasons why this year the G20 is trying to tackle and take steps to lift economic growth and employment. There is a recognition that we're integrated. There is a recognition we haven't returned to the levels of growth we've had before, and to be sustainable we need to generate employment. There's no guarantee of success. We've set ourselves an ambitious target, but to achieve that, not only the G20, but others will need to undertake the reforms that we're outlining. As a group, we think they're important enough that we can commit to them. We hope that others also do so, but it's no guarantee, of course. In terms of financial markets and the impact of quantitative easing, I think in recent years there has been some quite robust and heated debate within the G20 itself between the different policy options governments took, fiscal consolidation, austerity measures, and quantitative easing, and neither perhaps is the ideal solution. There's probably somewhere in between, but governments, in response to the domestic circumstances, made those judgments. And I have to say it wasn't just the United States. There was a range of governments have chosen to take quantitative easing as an option, and the others, of course, austerity measures. I think the important thing from the actions we're taking now is not to reduce that option, that is always there for governments to take, but to ensure that we share the information about them. And you gave the example, I think, earlier in this year when there was market reaction to what was not seen as a measure taken or foreseen that the US took in terms of changing their policy. We've had those discussions. In the end, reserve banks have a primary obligation to the domestic government. They can't signal steps before they've made those decisions. They can, though, make sure wherever possible they share that information in a more transparent way with markets, foreshadow their thinking and so on. It's not a guarantee. In the end, individual investors will make their own judgments about assets, and that can lead to the bubbles I think you're suggesting. What we can do is try to make the markets through regulation a little bit more resilient and more transparent so people understand the risks they're entering into, and hopefully there's appropriate capital and reinsurance arrangements behind them. Again, no guarantee against burning oneself in the market, but hopefully that information exchange contributes to greater stability. On the third issue, in terms of Russia and the West, I have to say bilaterally Australia condemns some of the actions that have gone underway in Russia and the Ukraine. We have ourselves taken sanctions and implemented them, and in response Russia has taken retaliatory restrictions on imports. So there's a very clear and present issue politically in Australia. Having said that, within the G20 we've continued the work we have with Russia. They're a member of the Troika, they're the president last year, and at the working level we continue to work together. The situation is fluid and it may be re-examined, but at the moment we see the primary focus of the G20 is economic cooperation, and that's continuing. Thank you.
Let's take our last question, please. Okay, then it will be our two last questions.
Charla McCauley, the National Center for Energy, Water and Energy Systems. The first question is about, since the formation of the G20, 1999, the issue of poverty and the distribution of the benefits was there, but there is nothing suggested about that because there is a strong relation between the distribution of the benefits and poverty. The second one is you have said two things about the financial institutions, resilience, and maybe that will be done by taxing. Taxes will make any shock absorbed by the people instead of the institutions themselves. The third one, you talked about energy, and you talked about competitive pricing, while actually the energy problem is greater than that, because the energy problem is really the transformation of from the existing, polluting, whatever, to clean, sustainable energy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I don't think I would disagree with the points you're making. What I would say in response is what I've outlined is where the G20 thinks it can add value in responding to these issues. Because the G20 in itself is not going to be the solution to many of the challenges I outlined. We can contribute to them. So for on poverty, I've focused on an economic response to that in terms of driving growth in the private sector. That's because the G20 is not a pledging forum, and nor should it take over the role, for example, of the UNDP and others. What it should do is try to reinforce those discussions, and where it can add value on an economic agenda, contribute to them. And there's a great deal of consciousness in the G20 about making sure we don't intervene in other processes. So some of the issues I've raised, for example, today would be complementary to the discussions around sustainable development goals and the post-2015 agenda. The G20 supports that discussion, but that's a UN-led discussion involving all members, and we don't want to intervene in that process. We'll give it political support, I suspect, at the end of the year. But after that discussion is concluded and we have clarity and agreement in the international community, I think then you will see the G20 return and maybe take new roles or new actions in support of the achievement of that. Having said that, we're open to suggestions from you and others, of course, if there are new areas we should be focusing on to fine-tune or to improve how we respond to those issues. So the actions I outlined are either implemented by G20 countries themselves or again through appropriate international organizations. On resilience, I hope I didn't mislead you. I don't think the solution is just tax. I think resilience goes far beyond that. There's a human aspect of resilience and human resource development, skills training. There's resilience of markets in terms of the financial regulation requirements now, greater requirements for capital for banks, greater transparency, publicity of information. So there's a whole range of actions taken forward. And we characterize resilience of the global economy as more than just the taxation issue, which I think is really just about information sharing. On energy, I couldn't agree with you more. It's not just competitive pricing. There's efficiency gains, there's new technologies. What we're looking at in the G20 is where we add value. We're not an energy organization. We shouldn't be necessarily getting those debates. What we can do is look at where we can make our own commitments. And so the work to date has been on energy efficiency, and we're extending that now into the consideration of governance of international institutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Our last question.
Thank you. I'm Rasm Al-Momen from Jordan Mechanical Engineering. I'd like to ask, since we are talking about the G20 is an international body and everybody now talking about globalization, how the G20 will provide support to other nations in respect to economic growth, since you mentioned the unemployment, and which is one of the major obstacles in economic growth, and how to fight, for example, unemployment, and how to preserve the middle class in third world countries. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think the positive impact, I hope, that comes from the actions the G20 take probably come in two broad areas. One is the work on the global financial regulatory system, because that creates greater security and stability for all in terms of our economic systems. The second is, to use an economic term, the positive spillovers of the actions G20 countries take themselves. So when I talked about unemployment policies or actions to benefit trade or impediments to investment, They are a series of themes describing actions the G20 countries are taking themselves domestically, because we feel that if we can generate growth in our own economies, that generates growth for our neighbours, because most of us are quite heavily integrated to our immediate neighbourhood or through other relationships and trading investment relationships. So there's a positive flow-on effect. The last point would be in the developing working group. We work with international bodies, particularly for low-income countries, but not only, and looking at the policies that should be put in place to assist them. So we're not being prescriptive on particular employment policies for countries outside the G20, but we're taking actions that we think will structure our economies to meet future challenges, and we hope perhaps that serves as an example and also generates growth. But we don't intervene or take forward action for others, and we're not a pledging forum, so we don't commit money as a group towards particular initiatives, although we may as donors, and not every member of the G20 would be a donor, may contribute to other means, be it through other international bodies. Thank you.
Thank you. في نهاية هذه المحاضرة لا يسعني سوى أن أتقدم بالشكر الجزيل.
At the end of this presentation, I would like to thank Dr. Daniel Sloper for his opinions about Australia and the G20, how we can work together toward global economic growth and prosperity. I thank you very much for participating with us in discussing this topic, and I would love to see you in the future in other lectures. And now allow me to invite you to dinner buffet, and thank you very much.